there's no privacy. You've got
Yeah.
people around you all the time, communicators, security people, things like that. And our standard in CENTCOM was be in communication with the president in 3 minutes.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, here with the Global National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, I'm joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, who will discuss global national security issues. What's Really Happening will take you behind the scenes and open the door to the experiences, knowledge, and insights of a senior leader who's commanded at the highest levels of the U.S. military, including commanding U.S. Central Command. Today, we'll explore the roles and responsibilities of four-star generals, the highest rank in the U.S. military. These officers commonly command tens of thousands of soldiers, airmen, guardians, Marines, and sailors around the world. And as of today, there's 44 active duty officers at the four-star level. To better understand the rank and the massive responsibility it carries, we will discuss with General McKenzie what it's really like to be a four-star. All right, good morning, General, and welcome back.
It's good to be here today.
So first off, let's talk about the reality of being a general versus kind of the public perception. In our minds, we have images of MacArthur storming a beach in the Pacific. You have, General Patton with his ivory-handled pistols. And then you have, General Grant maybe leaning over a large map table. These are images of what four-star high-ranking generals are actually doing. So what's it really like?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot of hard work.
Right.
It's a lot of learning that you don't control your schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people with complete demands on your time. Everyone's always looking at you. You have to be aware of that every minute of the day. You're always setting the example, because someone can always see. And you're also very mindful of the people whose lives depend on the decisions that you make. And that weighs on you, and that doesn't go away. That's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as you're in a position of responsibility. So it is a unique experience, and it depends on the job.
Sure.
Depends on the service. There are a lot of different cultures out there. And a lot of different levels of responsibility. Of course, my final level of responsibility was that of being a combatant commander. And that's a very high level of responsibility that requires your constant attention every waking moment.
Sure. And how does that differ? So there's different jobs as a four-star general or admiral, as you mentioned. So how does it being a Marine general in charge of Central Command differ from, saying, being the commandant in the Marine Corps, both four-star generals?
Tad, there are 11 combatant commanders in the U.S. military. A combatant commander is a person directly in the chain of command. He receives his orders from the Secretary of Defense and from the President. And every U.S. service member, wherever they are in the world, falls under the authority of a combatant commander. In the Central Command, my region, they're under my authority.
Sure.
And if you're in the United States, you're under the authority of Northern Command. If you're in South America, it's Southern Command. If you're in Europe, it's European Command. There are 7 geographic combatant commanders, and there are 4 functional combatant commanders. That is to say, combatant commanders who don't occupy ground, but who provide global services. For example, U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Special Operations Command are just some of them that actually perform these vital functions, yet they don't actually have geographic responsibilities. Rather, it's global. So what separates a combatant commander from, say, a service chief from the commandant of the Marine Corps is the commandant of the Marine Corps is responsible for recruiting the force, training the force, equipping the force, and then presenting the force to consumers. I'm a consumer. As a combatant commander, you consume ready forces and employ them in the service of the nation. So there's a big difference between what a service chief does and the responsibilities I've just outlined and what a combatant commander does. Those are a big, big difference. A service chief actually isn't in the chain of command. They're in what we call the administrative chain of command. They're very important jobs because they set the culture of the service. They determine what the service is going to look like many years down the road, and those are important responsibilities. But what they don't do is they don't employ the force, the battalions, the airplanes, the ships, whatever there are, in the service of the nation in accordance with the orders of the president.
That's interesting that they're not directly in the chain of command, because people see the chief of staff or the joint chief of staff often doing public press conferences. You're kind of feeling like they're the ones that are in the chain of command directly.
They are not. It is the chain of command of the United States runs from the President of the United States through the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. So when orders come down, that's the way they come. Now, you'll notice who's not in the chain of command either: the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's most senior military officer, and the principal military advisor to the president, to the secretary, and to other people as well. The chairman is not in the chain of command. He can't initiate an order. He can't give an order. What he does, though, is he advises the president, advises the secretary, and the joint staff. And I was once the director of the joint staff. Once the secretary decides to issue an order, it's the joint staff that issues that order, that turns a policy decision into a military order that then goes to the combatant commander.
That's fascinating. And so as a combatant commander, what does your days look like? So how do you execute? Obviously, they're going to vary differently, but what's a day look like in a combatant commander's?
Sure. So let's just take Tampa as an example. If I'm here in Tampa, which is where my headquarters was, it'll begin very early in the morning with an intelligence brief. And I would typically get up 6 or maybe a little earlier in my office, on base in my home. I'd go down, take a look at my emails, read an intelligence brief then, do some administrative business, come into the headquarters, and then I'd receive a series of briefings throughout the course of the morning. Typically, what I like to do every morning at 8 o'clock, I'd have my subordinate commanders. There were 9 of them. And we'd do a short around the horn, what's going on, what's changed. I'd try to do that 3 or 4 days a week. Sure. And that would be at a high level classification. My intelligence officer might brief, my operations officer might brief, other special functions that we needed to hear might brief during that period of time. But it'll be pretty fast, but I tried to do that every day, most days, I should say. So they got an opportunity to talk to me. We could be in and out of that meeting in 30 minutes.
Right.
It just can't go long. If you're going to have frequent meetings, they need to be short meetings. If you have nothing to say, don't say it. You don't need to talk just to hear yourself talk. So I've been in those meetings when they've gone very short. I've been in when they've gone a little bit longer. We had substantive matters to discuss. The other couple of days of the week, one day we would spend it focused on our international partners. There are over 30 international partner nations represented at U.S. Central Command. You want to be open, transparent with them because we depend on them. And so I would spend a day with them in this environment, getting a brief, talking about what's going on. Then we might do one day at a far higher level of classification with a very much smaller group of people where we talked about specific threats. And then one day a week, I did not meet with anybody outside the staff, but I spent a couple of hours with my planners, my strategic planners, just talking with them about the plans that we're working, contingencies that are coming up. Because I think for a commander, if you're going to do planning, you need to be involved in the planning. You can't walk into a room and tell them to do 10 things and walk out and come back a month later and see how they're doing. It doesn't work like that. You want to own the plan. It needs to reflect the personality of the commander. I feel very strongly about that. So I invested a lot of my time talking to him. So this would fill my morning. And then I'd have, in addition to that, I would have every day a series of 3 or 4 intelligence briefs, one with commanders. Then I would have another brief from my intelligence people at Central Command. Then I'd probably have another brief from the Central Intelligence Agency. Then another brief from the National Security Agency, all of them talking about very specific, highly compartmented things, some of which were so classified that on some occasions I'm the only officer in the headquarters that can receive the information.
Sure.
And sometimes it's just me and my intelligence officer. So as you can see, a large part of a combatant commander's day is spent up in meetings. And what you do in those meetings is you set the tone of the headquarters. You can never stop advocating, pushing your vision of what you want it to be and what you want to have happen. So you take all of those touch points and you use those touch points to shape the headquarters into what you want it to be. Now, when I travel, and I would travel almost half the time, I'm typically in the region. That is to say, somewhere in the Central Command Theater in the Middle East. That's a 16-hour flight over in a jet. So you fly to Shannon, Ireland, get off, stretch your legs, they'll refuel the jet, you'll fly the rest of the way. 2 8-hour legs, you'd work one leg, sleep one leg, depending on were you getting in the evening or in the morning, and what the rest of your day was going to look like once you got into the theater. But in the theater, what you're doing is you're doing outreach. You're talking to chiefs of defense. You're talking to ministers of defense. In many occasions, you're talking to the head of state. But you always begin those visits to any country with a visit to the U.S. ambassador because he's the president's representative in that country. So I would always go to see the U.S. ambassador, what's on the ambassador's mind. He needs to know why I'm there, and I need to know if there's anything I can do to help him while I'm there with the people that I'm going to see. So I would start with that, and then I would typically have a series of meetings with the countries, with whatever country I'm in. The chief of defense, we would sit down. There'd be probably 2 levels of meetings. There'd be a meeting staff level, big table, lots of people. And then there'd typically be a much smaller meeting, perhaps just the chief of defense and I, with our interpreters if an interpreter was necessary. And that would follow the pattern for the Minister of Defense. And if we're meeting the head of state, whatever the head of state wants to do, then I would adjust to, whatever he wanted for those kinds of meetings. So I would spend a lot of time doing that. And so there are 21 countries in Central Command, 19 of which I could visit. We're not going to Iran, obviously, and we're not going to Syria. And we're not going to Afghanistan now either.
Right.
But the rest of those countries, typically I'd be on a schedule to fly around. You visit some countries far more frequently than others, but you try to visit all the countries on a certain repetitive cycle throughout the course of a year. And as I said, you might have reason to go into one several times and spend a lot of time there, but it just depends on the situation. So you do a lot of that. Then, of course, the other thing you're doing when you're in theater is you're visiting our troops.
Sure.
You're visiting the people who are actually out there doing the work. You might go out to an aircraft carrier, might go out and visit a destroyer, go to an air base, go to wherever U.S. service members are, and you spend a little time with them so they understand who it is that's giving them their orders. It's important that they see that person, and I was always big about doing that. And they get an opportunity to share their thoughts about what's going on. It's important that they have that opportunity.
Sure. And so, like you discussed, as a combatant commander, you're either traveling, you're doing a lot of meetings to consume information, or you're out there meeting with partner and allies or U.S. representatives from other departments. So how does that affect your decision making? How are you going about making decisions and being able to execute your mission as a commander?
So when you have to make decisions, first of all, you'd like to have as much data as you can before you make a decision. I once learned from a really smart guy, General Jim Mattis, Secretary Mattis, that you want to get as much quantitative information as you can and reduce the qualitative space, the subjective space, to as small as possible. But it can't all be objective, and it can't all be quantitative in your approach. But you want to gather as much of that information as possible. So you have an understanding of how much time do I have to make this decision? What are the consequences? And then I'm going to want to talk to the people that are involved. I'm going to want, if it's an aviation decision, I'm going to talk to my Air Force Central Component Commander, a 3-star general, and I'm going to want to know what he thinks about it. He will have an opinion. I'll listen to that opinion. Talk to my operations officer, maybe my planner, depending on is it a plan or is it an ongoing operation. But what I would like to do is get as much input as possible. But eventually, you got to make a decision, and you got to know the timing of that decision. When do you want to make the decision, or can I delay decision a little bit? As a matter of personality, I prefer not to delay, but sometimes it's better to delay. And what you don't know is you don't want to make a decision till you got to make a decision. On the other hand, not making a decision is in fact a decision, and not usually a good one. So you got to be very careful when you sort of set that tone.
What type of decisions are you making at the combatant command level? Is it placing troops? Is it going on operations? What type of stuff are you looking at?
So it could be tactical. You could be affirming tactical military decisions made by your subordinate commanders. You could be, in many cases, it could be operational decisions. We're going to send this ship here. We're going to do that. Sometimes you've got to consult with higher authority. The Secretary of Defense may have an opinion on it. And that's all laid out pretty clearly. You know what your bounds of decision-making are. You know when you got to go up and get permission to do something. And by the time you've gotten to be a 4-star general, you've generally had pretty good experience in understanding those boundaries. So it's not a huge learning curve. However, the volume of decisions that you have to make, and the fact that often those decisions occur at 2:30 in the morning when you're awakened out of a sound sleep and you got maybe have a couple of minutes to make a decision, that takes a little bit getting used to.
Sure, I was going to say, because the region's obviously in a different time zone. So
it is, and that's the unique thing about CENTCOM. It's about 8 to 11 hours ahead, depending on where you are in CENTCOM, and that's a factor. And of course, Friday typically is a holiday in CENTCOM. Sunday's a work day, and so you've got in a lot of ways, the theater is on a different, certainly a different circadian rhythm, really, than life back here.
That's interesting. And when you think about being as the Central Command Commander, what are some things that surprised you once you assumed command? Some things maybe you didn't foresee coming up? Well,
I was very lucky in that I had been the J5, the strategic planner for CENTCOM from 2010 to 2012. And then in 2013, 14, I was the Central Marine Forces Central Command Commander as a 3-star. So I had good experience in CENTCOM. And then, of course, I was the big J5, the Joint Staff J5, and the director of the Joint Staff. So I saw all the issues, but seeing all the issues and being responsible for all the issues is a very different thing. So that's really probably the big thing. You can be prepared for it intellectually. You can be prepared for it in a lot of ways, but actually having the responsibility, the unique responsibility that you can't give away, it's a very interesting thing when you first realize it.
Sure. And you have all this responsibility, and you got tens of thousands of soldiers, airmen, Marines, all these different individuals in the region. So who did you seek advice from while you were trying to make your decision, if you had time to?
Sure. So, well, if I needed advice,
Mhm.
first of all, I would talk to the chairman.
Sure.
He's the nation's senior military officer. I was very lucky when I was a combatant commander. I had two great chairmen. I had Marine General Joe Dunford and Army General Mark Milley. They were both approachable. And if I felt that I needed to talk to them about a problem, they were always willing to spend the time so I could talk to them. Occasionally, I would talk to other combatant commanders because they know the scope and scale of the problem. They have the same burdens. And those are typically the people I would go to.
Okay. And when you're looking at that advice and what you're seeking from people, did you have a framework of, as a general, how you approached issues, like different categories of things you have to work? Because you're worried about the military situation on the ground, but you're probably looking at perspectives, what allies are going to think of this,
Right.
what enemies, of what the maybe the public's going to think.
Yeah, it's a multidimensional problem, and you've got to think about, when you make decisions, you're right, you got to understand the effect of the decision on your alliance structure in the region. What are our friends going to do? What do you want? What's the object of your decision? Are you attempting to reestablish deterrence with a potential enemy? Are you trying to assure our partners and friends in the region? Do I need to talk to the Department of State about this? And I would talk maybe at the ambassadorial level. Then I'd push it up so the secretary could go across to the Secretary of State, because I wouldn't reach out to the Secretary of State. I'd reach out to my secretary.
Sure.
That he would reach across. And that would all just depend on the nature of the specific problem that you're addressing. But you find that you're always generally well served to do a lot of coordination in advance. People don't like surprises. Your allies don't like surprises. The Department of State doesn't like surprises. And I know the Secretary of Defense doesn't like surprises.
Right. So you're trying to coordinate all that information. So as you're looking at issues that you faced and coordinating across the interagency or intergovernment space, what were the issues that you were facing very commonly as a four-star? Because was it all just very specific military stuff on the ground, or was it these other kind of diplomatic issues?
No, in many cases, it's we have a foreign military sales program where we sell vast amounts of military equipment to nations across the region. So how that program functions, every country's unique and different. There are challenges associated with each one. That takes a little bit of your energy, because if they're trying to buy fighter aircraft and there's a problem in the pipeline, you can't necessarily solve that problem within the Department of Defense, because many of those decisions are actually made by the Department of State. So you've got to know and understand how to work in that environment, reach across the state, understand the state perspective on it as you go forward and try to find a way to, either support or not support FMS. And you don't always support all those cases.
Right, because so there's just far more than just simply putting troops on the ground.
It is far more than that. In a word, it comes down to, you're the military representative of the United States in the region. So you want to be aligned with your Department of State comrades, the ambassadors, and big state, the regional bureau. You want to know what their perspective is, because we should remember the senior cabinet agency in the United States is the Department of State, not the Department of Defense. And it just sometimes, because of the Department of Defense's ability to produce things and make things happen, it looks like state is in the shadow, and that we should not think that's a good state of affairs. We need to be closely aligned with our state partners. And really, ultimately, the president, through the Secretary of State and through other channels as well, is going to be who establishes in foreign policy of the United States, of which the military element of national power is merely a supporting element.
Right. And when we're looking at, the different elements of national power, you have generals, four-star generals who are commanding regions. But for our listeners who are not of a military background, they might conflate, what a general is and what they command. So you have like a one-star general to a four-star general. What's the different level? So at the combatant command level, obviously you have an entire region, but as a one-star, what's the difference? As
a combatant commander, I have 21 countries: Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, Yemen in the south. Responsible for the U.S. Joint Force, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space, Coast Guard in that region. And so all those people ultimately work for me. I exercise what's called COCOM, Combatant Command Authority, the highest level of command, the most complete level of command that you can exercise. Now, when I was a three-star general, I commanded the Marine Forces inside Central Command, which was a slice of that. And my authority was not as broad as when I was a four-star. The issues were not as broad. I saw a certain slice of that, and not the whole picture. And you go down the ladder, your scale gets narrower in many cases. Still very, very critically important duties that you do. but your scope is narrower the further down you go.
You see that? Where's the scope? The biggest jump is it 1-star to 2-star, 2-star to 3, or 3 to 4?
There's nothing bigger in the U.S. military than the jump from 3 to 4-star.
Just massive
different because of who you talk to, because of how you're listened to, and your ability to influence national policy as a junior partner.
Sure.
You're not an equal because very important to the concept of the United States, and really my own personal view is civilians must be in charge. You have to have civilian control of the military. And in order to do that, you have to recognize that civil authority is the final vote in the equation. Military advice is given, best military advice is given, but ultimately the decision is going to be made by someone who's not wearing a uniform. And that's very important, and we need to keep it that way.
So how would we relate, speaking of the civilian chain of command? So again, our listeners that never served in the military, not as familiar. What's something comparative on the civilian side you might be able to compare a combatant commander to? Would it be a CEO or something in business?
To a degree, a CEO, but the difference is the liability is absolute.
Right.
In the military, it's moral. People die. You may A, be ordering people to be killed, and B, accept the fact that some of your personnel may be in grave risk. So that makes it uniquely different than I think any other profession. And what sets it apart is the probability of death and the fact that we assume a certain element of risk when we go forward into the theater.
Right. So are there leadership traits that might translate at that level of command?
Well, I think so. I think, good decision-making is good decision-making. And you try to, you want to make a good decision in a timely manner. You want to make decisions that make sense to your subordinates and that accomplish the goals that you've set out. And you've got to be able to communicate and sell your decision. Communication is very important. People have an image that people just bark orders in the U.S. military. That's not the way it works. The American soldier, the American Marine does not respond to just blankly being told what to do. You have to explain why we're doing this. And that's a great characteristic of American fighting men and women going back long before this generation. You have to sell what you're going to do. So effective commanders are commanders who can communicate their vision, communicate their orders, communicate their decisions to their troops, convince the young men and women who are out there on the line that this is in their best interest to do it, often when you're placing them in conditions of considerable personal risk.
Sure. And being able to communicate across lines down through your chain of command, how did your vision of communication change over your career? Like, did you always want to be a general and understand kind of those concepts, or how did that grow over time?
So no, I didn't always want to be a general, and I didn't. Marine Corps is strange. It's once a very smart guy told me, well, I don't know how we pick generals in the Marine Corps. Right. I mean, because it's a very difficult thing to understand. I've sat on 2 brigadier general selection boards as a 1-star, as a 2-star, and then as a 3-star officer. So I have the opportunity to watch the process work. I'm not sure either how we pick generals. I think we get pretty good people when we select them. If we're selecting 10, though, the next 10 in line are probably pretty good too. Right. The differences are very, very, very minute when you take a look at that. Which is probably good. It says something about the health of the service that you have that many qualified people.
Does it get political at that level?
It doesn't. I've never seen it be political. I mean, in a selection board, there's no discussion of that. Now, look, everybody knows you're talking about officers you all know.
Right. Yeah.
But the way you can talk about it's very circumscribed, very good, very. You're working off the record of the officer and your knowledge of the officer, and those are. In general, I would find that selection boards, and I think this is true across all the services, are pretty fair.
And as looking at the selection board promotions as you go through the military, during your career did you feel like you were going to get to that level that you were starting to go towards the stars compared to maybe retirement or something?
Yeah. So even when I was a colonel, I thought I was going to retire. My wife and I bought a big house in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Built it. In 2004, 2005, because I planned to retire there. And, so I found it's best not to plan too far ahead when it comes to things like that. The institution will make decisions based on your perceived value to the future of the institution, not based on the good job you've done. That's a great thing to remember that in the Marine Corps, I know this, we select generals based on their ability to help the Marine Corps. Not based on the fact they've had a great career and they've done a good job. Sure. What we call it, do they have legs? Can they continue to achieve? Can they continue to assist the institution in achieving its objectives? And that's how you select generals.
It's fascinating stuff. So as you went through the ranks of generals from 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, What are some things you miss about being a general, whether 4-star or 1-star?
I miss being in charge.
Right. Yeah.
I miss knowing what's going on. I miss feeling that you're making decisions that have a substantive input on what the United States is doing.
Mhm.
And I didn't mind the responsibility. I miss that. But it was, in my case, I did it for 3 years, which is the period of time you're a combatant commander. It was time for me to go. I didn't have to carry me kicking and screaming over the side. I turned over to a very, very good officer, and he's doing a great job at Central Command now. So it was time for me to go, and so I left when that 3-year time was up. There are things you miss. It's not the airplane. It's not all the perks. It really is command is what you miss. And I think if I were a 4-star and not in command, it would have not been as much fun. Command is actually more important than the 4 stars.
The position over the rank in some sense.
Position over the rank, much more important to me at least. I enjoy being in command.
Sure. So what, you spoke about not going kicking and screaming. Were there some things you didn't like about 4-star command?
Sure, I didn't. The fact that you are literally, there's no privacy. You know, you've got people around you all the time, communicators, security people, things like that. And our standard in CENTCOM was be in communication with the president in 3 minutes. If you had, and so we were pretty good about that. And that means if you're going to do that, you've got to accept that there are going to be people in your house. There are going to be people always in your vehicle. And then you got to be ready to, if they call you at 2 a.m, you got to be ready to talk at 2 a.m. There were nights when I get 10 phone calls a night. There were nights when I'd go a week and not get a phone call. More times with phone calls than without. But it was just, so you got to realize that. My wife she's very good, takes the wife's buy-in, and Marilyn bought in. So we were good at that, but it takes a toll on you.
It sounds like you'd have to have an operations center in your bedroom. Just wake up, turn a switch on.
We had a bank of phones in 3 locations in the house. Had it in the kitchen, in my office, and in the bedroom. And by bank of phones, I'm talking about 5 phones.
Wow. So yeah, that's a lot.
Different levels of classification, and yes, and so I could tell by the tone which phone it was, what level of classification, and probably who was calling.
Because it does sound like being in a movie or something, doesn't it?
It's got some characteristics of that.
So speaking of films, is there any film that you feel like depicts what a 4-star has to go through? I mean, obviously, a lot of the films we have now, like Patton or something that cover specifically a general's career, it's normally during like World War II, which is kind of different than what a general would deal with today.
Right. There are not a lot of great movies out there on being there are a lot of war movies out there that are interesting about command at different levels.
Sure.
But a 4-star general, I can't think of much. I will tell you a movie that I've always enjoyed. It's a movie called 7 Days in May. And it's actually an old movie, early 1960s, black and white film. But it's about a plot by the Joint Chiefs to overthrow the government of the United States. From a book, same title, 7 Days in May, best-selling book. That movie's worth watching. And I liked it because in it, the Marine director of the Joint Staff saves the day.
Right, yeah.
And the Marine director is played by Kirk Douglas.
Oh, nice.
And,
okay.
So I've got a couple of movie posters of that movie at home with Kirk Douglas as the director of the Joint Staff. That's a good movie that talks a little bit about civil-mil relations, although more overblown. There's no risk of the Joint Chiefs of Staff overthrowing the government. That's not going to happen. But that's not a bad little movie.
Was in what year did you say I was roughly?
Early 60s.
Early 60s. Yeah,
probably 60, 61.
Well, that was kind of a piece of the times there with the Vietnam War and everything. And the Joint Staff. Not that they were going to overthrow, but just the tensions between.
Yeah, the very beginning of it.
Yeah. What lastly, as we kind of wrap up this, what being a 4-star general is, what it takes. What advice would you give to junior officers who might be aspiring for stars? What advice would they?
Spend your time not aspiring for stars. Spend your time doing your job. Bloom where you're planted. Don't be thinking about the next job. Think about the job you got. Do the job you got as well as you can do it, and things will take care of themselves. People who plan ahead like that typically don't find success. You need to be concentrated on what you're doing. Sure, do you have something in the back of your mind? You might want to be a battalion commander. Think about that. Don't think about being a general. If you're a company commander, you can think, gee, I'd like to be a battalion commander. If you're a battalion commander, I'd like to be a regiment or a MU commander. That's what you should think about, not, wow, I wish I had 2 stars. I wouldn't waste any time at all thinking about that because the odds are minute.
Right, yeah.
They're very minute. And luck is a factor in it.
Sure.
I mean, if you're selecting one person out of 100, there are probably 10 people out of that 100 that can do that job. And it just happens to be you or someone else is the person that gets chosen for that. And when you're chosen, you should be very humble and recognize that there are a lot of good people they didn't choose. And some of them, I would argue, I've looked around and I've thought there were better people than me that could have been doing this job. but just fell to my circumstance to do it through a variety of reasons. Luck is a factor, a profound factor that you just can't rule out in this profession.
Sure. And emphasizing on where you are is a good point. Don't be leaning too far into the future.
Wherever you are, whatever job they give you to do, don't complain. Do the job. And then if you want to better your circumstances, sure, but do the job first. Gain a reputation for, we want you to go here and do this job. Okay, I'm going to go here and do this job. And don't complain. I did that. I took on some jobs that were not fun and did them well. And the rest took care of itself.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the conversation today, General.
Thanks, Dad. Always good being with you.
And that wraps up another episode of What's Really Happening, with a fascinating discussion on what it's like to be a 4-star general with a GNSI Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. Again, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to our next conversation on What's Really Happening.